It's all about the money. Follow the money. What would you do if you knew the global economy was going to contract because of the food prices? What would you do?
Adapt 2030 Mini Ice Age Conversations covers changes in our climate due to a new and intensifying grand solar minimum. In the media, overlooking, downplaying, or burying cold weather changes occurring on our planet. This is in order to keep the global warming agenda steaming full speed ahead. I do this podcast and radio program because we need to begin conversations on how to adapt our food growing strategies long before 2030 as agricultural zones shift, affecting global crop output, but very few mainstream media outlets are talking about the most important issue of our time: cold weather crop losses. Our sun is going through a 400-year cycle, which has effects on our weather patterns as our magnetosphere weakens and the jet streams go out of flow. It's not CO2, it's not you, it's the sun. Are you ready to thrive in the Grand Solar Minimum? Then join me for Mini Ice Age Conversations. I'm your host, David DuByne.
Become a global leader for a moment. Put your brain in a global leader position. Take yourself out of your complacency and put yourself into your leading people. And you're trying to mitigate the death toll. What would you do? This is the question you need to run with in a mind experiment. Now let's go over. I'm going to jump over to the Watchers News. I like the Watchers. I've been following these guys for several years now. They talk about earth changes, severe weather, and space weather. They have some incredibly good headlines that aren't picked up in other news feeds. And now the Atlantic Multi-decadal Oscillation, the AMO, which is that conveyor belt of warmer water that, keeps Europe warmer than it would be, because when you look at places across Europe, they're on the same latitude as Moscow. Now, without that conveyor belt bringing that warmer water, Europe would be pretty much like Moscow during the winters. But that AMO is actually officially turned into its cool phase over the next 60 years. That's not anything to do with the sun in terms. This is a natural 60-year cycle of cooling and warming. And the IPCC doesn't put this in their models either. So AMO cooling for the next 60 years somehow didn't get added into the IPCC's models. It's only CO2. And it's really interesting how they're trying to also say that the latent heat that's at 800 meters. And those of you in the US, a meter is 3 feet. So let's multiply 800 by 3. How deep is that? 2,400 feet deep in the ocean is being heated by CO2. That latent heat is coming from somewhere. Where do you think heat under the ocean touching the crust might be? So there's an enormous amount of volcanic eruptions going on underwater as well. They can't explain the heat, so they're trying to blame it on CO2. But at 2,400 feet underwater, I'm sorry, I'm just not buying the CO2. Even a kindergartner would be like, what? How's that gas? That's not it. It's 0.3% penetrating 2,400 feet under the sea surface. Come on, man. Even a kindergartner would laugh at that and say, how does that happen?
And this episode's brought to you by TrueLeafMarket.com. Heirloom and organic seeds since 1974. Full range of garden seeds, microgreen seeds, sprouting seeds, wheatgrass, grain seeds, flower seeds, herb seeds, and ground cover crop. I encourage you to take a look at their website, TrueLeafMarket.com, and they even have free starter guides there for you to learn how to grow sprouts, microgreens, herbs, and wheatgrass. Use the link below and give yourself the gift of organic and heirloom seeds.
So Spain is a major vegetable producer over in Europe. They were absolutely crushed. And when I say crushed, I mean it figuratively as well, because those ice storms that came down in Palmyra took away what was remaining of the greenhouses that survived and were rebuilt from last year with the exact same circumstances. So if you weren't following the news and if you didn't catch up on last year, greenhouse growers in Spain were so decimated by ice storms, wind, and cold that they caused vegetable shortages in the UK and other parts of Northern Europe where they export to. And then it happens again the second year in a row, and nobody's talking about this. France as well with the Vineyard losses, second year in a row. Austrian losses, third year in a row. German vineyard losses, second year in a row. But somehow because it's only second year in a row, it's just something, oh, well, it's just part of weather. It's just weather, don't worry about it. It's not climate, it's weather. But I'm trying to put up something and say, hey, the climate is changing. So you would look for these signals and signs of the changing climate, which are going to result in strange weather. Now, if you know what you're looking for in a fingerprint of the Grand Solar Minimum, and you use a history book, you go back through history and you read about the accounts of the time, then you can find these GISP 1,000-year temperature reconstructions using ice core data, which the IPCC loves to talk about the ice reconstruction temperature record, and they use that as the Bible to prove global warming. But if you go any further back than just a couple hundred years, they don't want to talk about that because it proves that natural variability in temperatures. So people always ask, how are you getting your information to put these forecasts out for cooling in the future? Well, I start with a history book first. I read about the accounts, which there are many, by the way. Not as much as today on the modern internet, and there's millions of stuff on the internet that you could research about today's modern weather in the last 50 years. But when we take steps back in time, back into the early 1800s, there's remarkably good records. There was an enormous amount of settlers around, and there's really good records kept for the last 200 years. That's your first stop. Look what happened in the Dalton Minimum. Read about the changes. The American explorers that came over and were going way up in Lewis and Clark and going way, they experienced the same thing. Gigantic, massive hails, crushing encampments, same types of snowstorms followed by extreme heat the next day, or extreme heat and out of season, anomalous events with jet streams. And it's almost like exactly, if I were to take the journals of Lewis and Clark and bring them today and just erase all the dates out of it and the names out of it, I would think I was looking at a modern weather report from this week. And then you go back into the modern minimum, and you just have to go back into the history of when the wars were started, when the famines came in, when the plagues did, and you start to find these matchups. And then you can find people who have written manuscripts that have been translated from various languages and find out what's happening with the weather at that time. Same thing. They were talking about the hail the size of grapefruits coming down routinely that would crush crops. They even had one report that the size of the hail was so larger than any fruit that was known in Europe, that crushed a town so badly that when it came, it was flattened to the ground, and they didn't even know there was a town there because the splinters of wood had even been driven into the mud. And we start to see the same things again. Argentina getting pummeled with like really world record hail. That piece of hail that they recovered as a single piece is being entered in the Guinness Book of World Records for the largest hailstone ever recorded. So when you start to look at these historical recounts in history books of people on the ground telling you of their experiences, this is your first place to look. And especially in your regional area, you have local libraries, local universities, and they have a way better collection. And you can actually talk with the librarians person to person and then ask them for something. And, librarians are really cool. They know a lot of secret information, if you will. They're like, oh, there's this one book nobody ever gets out, but there's some cool stuff in there you should look at. There's these lithographs you need to check out in this one book, but it's not, it hasn't been scanned or on microfilm yet. You can only find it this one place in the library. These are your best resources. And there's so much information that verifies these cycles in history, and we're just starting to see the same thing again. So I start with the written accounts, and when we start to see the same thing talking about France, the revolutions going on there, all brought on by wheat crop losses and vineyard damage, that's the reason they started the fruit walls. Now, fruit walls are south-facing, and then you grow your crops, so the south-facing wall absorbs heat during the day. You can grow vines on there, and you notice at the end of that particular time period, they're literally walled cities because these walls were not for enclosures for animals. The walls were there to absorb heat and put crops along them so they could still continue to have agriculture in the country. You got to look up fruit walls. Not many of them are left today because they were used for building materials, and they were moved out of the way when new areas of development came through. So what was back then, 350 years ago, is not still in place, but the fruit wall infrastructure apparently was a never-ending maze, specifically around Paris. It was thousands of miles of walls of fruit walls around the cities. So when you start to see the same matchup in France, and then you got in Austria, we got in Germany, and then we got Portugal, and the list is long for the matchups. But somehow the mainstream doesn't really want to put two and two together. They just keep saying, oh, it's weather, it's weather. But I'm here to tell you, in my personal opinion, you can agree or disagree, but it's really not weather. It's the new climate that's just starting to show its normal pattern, which will intensify. So I don't know how many years it's going to take of this type of weather and these type of events and crop losses in the same regions before people start to say, well, maybe the climate is changing because of our sun going into a grand solar minimum. I want to come on a little point there too. I keep seeing again and again these links to articles that people send me by with the same parroted, repeated 0.3 degrees Celsius drop due to a grand solar minimum based on the total solar irradiance, or the TSI. The articles are speaking truth. They are. I'm not going to bag them. They're actually putting it out there. I applaud some of them for coming out the way they do. And they say, hey, we are coming into a grand solar minimum. The temperature is going to drop 0.3 of a degree based on the total solar irradiance declines that we experienced over the last grand solar minimums. I applaud them for putting out the information. But then they stop there and they say, well, the 0.3 is not going to affect us. And then after, another decade or two, we'll resume global warming again because of CO2 influence. They're leaving out 90% of the other influences that drive and cause grand solar minimums and extreme weather. They don't talk about the cosmic rays. There has been a new report issued that the cosmic rays that were forecast to increase 20% over the next low solar cycle, already we've eclipsed that already. It's staggering. They're so blown away by this that they're scared what's happening. Because the cosmic rays are also responsible for increasing cloud cover. They were predicting a full 20% increase between the solar max and the solar min, but we're not even at the solar min yet, and it's already eclipsed 20%. So they're looking another 13, 14% increase, putting a 30, 35% increase in. That in itself is going to alter life as you know it. The cloud cover that's going to increase, the size of the hail, the electrical storm ferocity, the wind speeds, the out of sync jet streams. Our magnetosphere is weakening. That's the reason the jet streams are going out of place. But the increase in clouds, they're not talking about that. They're not talking about the weakening magnetosphere from the sun declining in its activity state on a 400-year cycle. They surely peg in these articles with 0.3 of a degree of cooling based on TSI drop from the grand solar minimum. They surely talk about the effects from the sun, but they don't really talk about the effects from the sun. They don't break it down. They just say, well, the sun's going to go into a solar minimum just like it does, but this is going to be sort of a longer duration minimum, and it's going to drop temperatures, but nothing to worry about. It's just, it's a cycle, but, IPCC missed that somehow. We're actually going to cool, but they still want your global tax money for everything that you consume, everything you buy, everywhere you go, because they're going to tax fuel. Somehow they missed that. But they're not talking about the cosmic rays. They're not talking about the wandering magnetosphere due to effects. And our magnetosphere is going to get weaker as we progress into the depths of the grand solar minimum around 2025. And at that point, what you're seeing now, the weather right now is incredibly mild compared to what's coming. What is about to rip our planet apart crop-wise will be remembered in history as the greatest wipeout of economy on the planet, as well as loss of life. There's more people on the planet now than there ever were. So the Maunder minimum, 25% of the world population died at that time. But you have to realize back in the 1600s, there were barely 1 billion people here. But when we come to today's numbers, there's 8 billion people on the planet. So in terms of everything, it's just going to be, levels above. And then they're not talking about volcanic eruptions with the aerosols in the atmosphere, which block sun naturally, a year without a summer, but then also that other particulates also have charge that, increase cloud cover, add to nucleation, add into the cloud bands, just these other things are not talking about. And the galactic cosmic rays themselves from the sun and galactic cosmic rays, both sources, have an effect on the planet that activates or agitates or does something with our magma chambers that creates more volcanic activity. And here these news articles are only talking about TSI dropping 0.3%. Okay, when you add in more cloud layers, that's going to drop it even further. And then when you add in volcanic aerosols, it's going to drop it even further. And if we get a major eruption of VEI 7, VEI 6 multiple times, this is going to drop temperatures even further. So they're just talking literally about the first layer of cooling, TSI drop. That's it. And why is it that they're warning you that the TSI is dropping? And why are they warning you that the temperature is going to drop, but they don't fully go into the full maximum possibility of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius drop over these next years? That in itself, the extreme winds, the extreme hail, the extreme rains, the extreme drought, forget that. Let's just talk about temperature in general. Plants are set in their hardiness zones. If you drop the temperature 3 degrees Celsius, that's approximately 6 degrees Fahrenheit, that is going to take some plants out of their zones, for sure. Just that alone would damage crop production. And now let's add in the layers on top: extreme winds, extreme rainfall events, extreme hail. And we start to see this extreme drought. And that's another thing that the IPCC loves to say, that drought's caused by CO2, but you just really need a history book, and you can start to see that climatically droughts are part of this. And California's, after it gets through this rainy period, what we see in these next few years, it's going to go into a mega drought. Far beyond this little drought that they had over the last few years, where everybody's saying, oh, the water's going to run out, the drought. That's small in comparison to a grand solar minimum drought that encompasses that part of the planet. Deserts become wetter. So what's considered Four Corners area right now is going to bloom. And here's the thing about South Africa too. South Africa dries out and gets into a mega drought during this time. Cape Town running out of water, crops being lost, super floods. You know, here's the thing that I even talked to some farmers. I was really interested because of the land confiscation going on down there. So I actually called some people I know that still are farmers down there, and I talked to them, and I talked to some other people I'm associated with and know that are South Africans that still have families and farms and businesses down there. I wanted to get the firsthand report of the crops. So I called down there, called somebody over around Durban, and then I called somebody down near Cape Town, both, 2 people. And then I had an intermediary friend who's not there right now, but we just talked. So I got 3 different sources, and then they made some calls and they got back to me with some information because of the answers I couldn't get when we had our own questions going on here. First thing is the farmers reporting. The drought is there, but then after, if it does rain, it rains exceptionally heavy and everything just runs off and it floods, and whatever was trying to come up just gets washed away. So the rains are not becoming more of a hindrance than they are a help at the moment. The ground is baked hard. And this was also explained to me that, hey, that drought is not 100% natural, but it also has, you know, things to do with the engineering that's going on there and the water flows, et cetera. Now they're catching up. So if they can get this whole water engineering thing, maybe the drought won't be so severe around Cape Town. But anyway, that is part 1. Part 2, I really need to ask the question, South Africa is going into a mega drought that's going to affect crop production. Now, South Africa is a major wheat producer. South Africa is showing the very first signs of wheat losses that is going to be making news headlines. I do believe Australia will follow this year as well. But at the first time, when you're looking in the Southern Hemisphere, currently, South Africa is the #1 most affected place in the Southern Hemisphere showing crop losses. It has to be reported now. It must. It has to. It's no longer sweepable under the rug. You have to report it because the losses are gargantuan. Which begs the question is, why is the ruling party allowed to go in and then remove white farmers from their land with no compensation? Is this, and my question to you, is this a political move to then explain the crop losses which are happening? Because even in the smoothest of transition from owners of farms and mechanized machinery and systems and trade, it's going to be a reduction anyway, even at the smoothest of transitions. But this transition is messy. So it really begs the question, is this political move allowed to happen to try to mask the losses that are happening in South Africa with the grain crops at the moment? Because you saw the playbook when Mugabe in Zimbabwe confiscated all the land from farmers. Their crop production went down to zero. It was a mess. You see hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. They had $1 trillion notes. Their crop production went to absolutely zero after they confiscated all the land. Now, knowing that, could this confiscation of land currently be happening? And I'll leave you to come up with your own conclusion whether it's to mask the effects. Because it's at the point where the world's starting to wake up. And once you realize that the amount of grain's not coming out of South Africa, how much is this going to affect the global price? And when that happens with the loss of grain in South Africa, people might start asking questions. Well, where else is grain being lost? Now, Christian over at Ice Age Farmer is doing an amazing job. You should check out his Ice Age Farmer wiki. He is compiling anomalous weather events and grain crop losses and different types of crop losses globally on a real-time map that you can add to if you find some crop losses in your local area. The amounts of grain coming out of a country, the losses over the total with what's in storage are called the carryover stocks in the silos globally, and do a forecast out if we just remain at today's loss levels, how much carryover stock is there to provide us through the next few years compared to an amplification of like step 1A up, step 2B up. And then what if those double in the crop loss amounts next year? What are the carryover stocks? How far can we carry out with that? And remember the loss of protein content as well. So this is my focus of study is trying to put out. And so far what I've come up with is 2021 is the rollover period. If we stay and we double what today's losses are, just even at the minor losses we're experiencing now, if we double that, and we'll see what happens. You can switch crops and you can bring new areas online. I understand that. Like Myanmar is a great example. They only use 50% of their arable land. They used to be the breadbasket of Asia. They used to grow the most rice in Asia. But again, that's rice. Cultures are used to their own native foods. Like, can you get Americans and Europeans to switch over to have rice every single day compared to having bread, wheat, and different types of things we're used to? So these substitution crops, I mean, millet. How many of you know how to cook millet? How many of you cook sorghum? Can you switch? These are the types of things that are going to come forward. This ethanol mandate, too, needs to be reversed, and we need to start using that cropland that's to waste in our gasoline tanks that doesn't have the same amount of calorific value to burn your gasoline. It's only 90% as effective. Let's say there's a 10% loss when you're using ethanol when you're adding to gasoline. You have to actually add another percentage on top because the ethanol density, when you're looking at the amount of literal power inside that, where the oil has much more than ethanol. So anyway, we need to get rid of that ethanol mandate. Take into consideration the amount of time that we do not have these days. Everybody's incredibly busy. So you can see why there's not a lot of action taken, going forward, talking about these types of events is everybody is just so incredibly busy. There's a million distractions out there in the media, and the amount of distraction is absolutely going to increase as well as we get into the crop losses, because what's the best way to make you not think about something? Distract you. There should be more focus on the crop losses happening globally, but there isn't. There's more distraction, but there's very little attention paid to crop losses. And when you do, then it's tried to deflect and, don't talk about it. Move to something else. The distraction in the media would be your second indicator. Like the crazier it gets in the media, the closer we're getting to. And when a major war starts somewhere to really distract you, and we're not talking something small either, it'll be a major event. That we're really just a year or less away from the full world being globally affected by crops and rising prices to the point where it'll bring people out into the streets asking for governmental change. They're going to need that type of huge distraction to take the masses' minds off of the food price rises. And then at that time, too, they can also blame anything that's not being delivered on a global conflict or parts of a regional conflict. I don't think it's going to be a global one. I really doubt that. It'll be something regional, but big enough that it'll take up the news headlines every day. And also it'll be an area where they grow some food, so then they can explain that it's offline And then everybody says, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense. It's offline over there. There's deliveries. There's a war going on. And it's just, yeah, I can understand why there's not. So maybe that's part of the reason that the losses are happening. So it's a very purposeful, to be a very purposeful, very planned, very massive distraction campaign going forward. So just look for those things. You know, the crazier it gets in the news, that's an indicator. It's going to be mind-bogglingly numbing by the time we get up to this point in 2020 when the crop losses truly hit and they're trying to distract you away and keep you from panicking and keep you from pulling your money out of the banks to go buy preparatory materials. That's what I'm saying. Get ready now, because everything's available at the moment. But in 2 years, everything's not going to be available for you. That's just the thing. When people get scared, they hoard, they panic buy, they do all kind of crazy stuff that they're not doing at the moment. So maybe you need one water pipe, one valve at the moment for your garden. You might go buy 2. Okay, great. But in a panic buy, somebody would buy 10 or 20, all of them. I'll take the whole box. And this is the kind of mentality that we're going to get into, because then they know that whole box, then they could trade it further on because somebody else will need it, and then they can, you know, get something else for it tradable further down the line. I mean, that's just the way people think. Papua New Guinea, the reason I bring that up is they also had major eruption in the 1100s that created something, a year without a summer. That was in the Papua New Guinea area. And we see the same active volcanic regions coming to life again. Sinabung, that's just connected to the Toba magma chamber anyway. And then Tambora, that's another year without a summer. It's interesting how all these equatorial volcanic areas are the ones that cause year without a summer type of events. The further up you get, north or south in the latitude, so the Cascadia Range, even if it erupted huge, would only have a regional effect and just cool moderately parts of the northern hemisphere. Where when you get massive ash plumes up into, seems like the equatorial band, they're able to spread more evenly or something, but there's a direct correlation on equatorial eruptions and the amount of effect it has cooling compared to more northerly eruptions and the effect it has regionally on cooling. I've done a couple of videos on that specifically. Got a lot of land splits. There's so many more sinkholes and land rifts opening up, and you just need to wonder what's happening with the crust of our Earth when we're seeing so many of these holes and cracks. But again, when you go back into Sasha Dobler's work over on Abrupt Earth Changes, he's talking about the spore minimum in Europe, and they talked about the exact same thing, the ground opening up, foul-smelling gases coming out, foul-smelling gases killing birds and flocks of birds. The same exact thing that is happening around has been nothing more than a repeat in history, cataloged by, people alive at that time. And mark my words, 100,000 people pull all their money out of their retirement savings. It's not going to really dent a market. I understand the bank will be very pissed, and you'll probably have to do a Himalayan-sized mountain of paper to explain why you want to pull your funds out early. Because by the law, you deposit your money in a bank, it's not yours, it's the bank's. You gave them the right to your money. It's called a bail-in. So whatever happens with the bank, they take your money first because you legally gave the money to them. It's not yours anymore. If you're holding money in a bank account, it's not yours. Sorry. So when you want to get it out, they ask all types of questions. Now you want a few $1,000s out. A friend of mine wanted to buy a used tractor, super cool tractor. It was from, we were going to refurbish it and put a new one. I learned a lot about, tractors and tilling and things. I didn't know that before. I was really thankful. But he wanted to pay cash for this. So he was telling me the story about, he wanted all these papers from the bank, and it was his own money. And he'd been a customer for like 20 years at this bank, knows the people there. It's a small town, knows everybody by name. They know him. And they still needed all this paperwork just to get cash out. So he could even buy a tractor locally. And the people in the bank knew the dude he was going to buy the tractor from. And they still needed all this paper to explain why he wanted his own money out. Now, this is at a local bank where everybody in the community, in the farming community, everybody knows everybody else. But they still needed that much paperwork to get his own money out of the bank, cash. What's going to happen when people want to cash out their retirement funds early to get ready for the Grand Solar Minimum? What happens when people really pull all their money out of the bank? What happens when they cash out all their stocks? This is going to send just tsunami waves through the economic system as we know it today.
This video is brought to you by our friends at TrueLeafMarket.com. Heirloom and organic seeds for any grow zone on our planet.